Hello and welcome to Cooking Candor. Today we're going to make some kind of stew. It's kind of like a depression style stew. It's supposed to be really inexpensive and therefore make you feel a little bit better about life. I actually checked on this soup though. I wanted to see with the ingredients that I used, was this soup cheaper than say buying a can of ready-made soup? I mean, it depends on the brand, but let's say, for example, just a can of chunky Campbell soup. And this soup is more expensive. So it was probably about 40 cents more expensive per, I think it was like 16 or 20 ounces or something like that. So definitely a little bit more expensive, and it could be cheaper or more expensive just depending on what exactly you put in this stew. I did buy some vegetables here that were maybe a little bit on the higher price side, but nothing really extravagant is going in my stew. I think when I went to the grocery store, there was some really yummy looking squash, so I decided to go for some squash in my stew. So you can see that I just chopped up some celery. It's just very rough chop. Don't worry too much about getting the chopping to be exactly the same size or anything. The only thing that I would worry about is making sure that you have a very sharp butcher style knife. The carrots, you do want to chop carrots just a little bit smaller just because they do take longer to cook typically than anything else that's going in this stew. But you can see super rough chop. The hardest thing about this stew is honestly cutting up all these vegetables. And in my case, I used rather difficult vegetables for some of these. So if you've ever wondered how to prepare some of these vegetables, you're about to find out. There are multiple different ways to prepare some of the vegetables, but I used my method because of what I was wanting to do with the vegetables. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Here I'm using a vegetable that is actually a really interesting vegetable that's called a rutabaga. Now, my grandmother grew these in her garden and she put them in her soups all the time. So for me, this vegetable is like nostalgia. A lot of people, I think, especially younger people, probably don't know what the heck this vegetable is. So interestingly, this vegetable is a hybrid between turnips and cabbage. And so if you like turnips, you could use turnips instead. If you like cabbage, you could even use cabbage instead. I happen to very much like the flavor profile of this vegetable, again, because it's kind of like nostalgia. It's very hard. It keeps its shape when it's cooked for a long period of time. It's excellent in things like roasts, soups. You can cut it up and eat it raw with a little bit of salt and pepper on it. If you've ever had the vegetable kohlrabi, it is kind of similar to kohlrabi in flavor. It's a little bit stronger of a flavor. You definitely get cabbage vibes from it. But it's interesting because of the way that it kind of holds its shape. Like if you don't like the texture of cooked cabbage, but you like the flavor, this might be the vegetable for you. It's very hard. And so you saw me cut away the outside because it's covered in a type of wax. So you can see that I am only chopping up half of this rutabaga. And so the other half I'm actually saving because I'm going to use the same ingredients to create a different dish later on. So again, you can see I'm just kind of cubing these roughly about the same size. These do also take just a tiny bit longer to cook than, say, something like potatoes or something like squash. This is a butternut squash. Butternut squash is delicious squash. It's probably like my favorite squash. It's got a really kind of sweet flavor to it. It's buttery, it's sweet tasting. It's just a very good squash. Again, this is very good for roasting. My mom makes a really good squash soup out of this. It's the kind like if you were to go to the grocery store and pick up a can of squash soup, it's probably going to be made out of this specific squash. You can see that I'm preparing this in a way that is kind of interesting. I'm actually kind of peeling it with my knife. And a lot of people, to prepare something like this, they might like pre-roast it or something like that to get the skin off. Because of what I'm doing with this in the soup, and because I'm intending to save half of it for my dish later on, I am going to peel it and then dice it for the soup. And part of the reason why, too, is because it's a totally different flavor profile than if I had roasted it. And that's not really what I want in my soup. My soup, I really want it to be like these kind of raw, natural flavors of these foods. So I'm not trying to like roast it with any kind of garlic or bring out any real other different kinds of flavor, because when you caramelize it a little bit, it tastes a little bit different. Not to say that there's anything wrong with caramelizing. It is absolutely delicious roasted. Here is another squash. This is an acorn squash. Acorn squash is actually just a little bit, it's different. It doesn't taste the same. It's also extremely good roasted. It's really delicious roasted. My mom used to roast this squash constantly when I was growing up. So you roast it with a little bit of garlic butter, absolutely delicious. But you can see here I'm preparing this in the exact same way. I am just using my knife to peel the outside. The only really important thing is that you need it to be stable. So you saw me cut the bottom off before I then put it on the table so that it was actually stable. You want to be very careful if you try to prepare squash like this, because it is actually really slippery. So that's just kind of a word of caution. It's also quite difficult. It really helps if you lift weights once or twice a week. You can see I'm just going to cut it in half. Here we have all of these seeds. I'm going to take all of the seeds out, and I'm going to save the seeds because I'm going to roast the seeds. You can roast the seeds of these exactly the same way that you would roast pumpkin seeds. This is all very similar to preparing and gutting a pumpkin for Halloween, just less fun. Just getting some rounds of practice in before the big day. The flavor profile of this one is not so sweet. It is a little bit more on the savory side. If, like me, you're looking at this thinking, gosh, that looks exactly like cantaloupe. Well, squash and melons are both part of the Cucurbitaceae family, also known as the gourd family, according to Google. So yes, squash are actually fruits. So this is my first time ever having this squash or ever preparing this squash. This squash is called buttercup squash. I'll tell you what I thought about it at the end of the video. I am preparing this in the exact same way. I'm using my knife to peel it. This squash actually had a much tougher exterior than the other squash. At this point, my hand is actually starting to kind of cramp up from holding the knife so tightly and everything. You really have to grip really, really tightly just because of the slickness of the squash. So again, I'm just going to cut this in half, and you will see why it is that I have this really epic meat cleaver on standby. But first, it's time for the instant replay of my amazing knife skills. I cannot get through this squash because I skipped lifting weights last week. And then we're going to scoop out the seeds again. And I'm going to save the seeds because I'm going to roast all of them together at the end of all of this. The squash has a nubbin. And like all nubbins, we just had to cut it out and it was fine. So once again, just cutting it up, rough chops into roughly the same size kind of cubes. And now I'm just going to roughly chop up an onion. It's just a sweet yellow onion. Again, the hardest thing about making this soup is just the vegetable prep. And again, I chose vegetables that were very hard to prep. If you wanted to, you can make this stew and it will be absolutely delicious with just potatoes, onions, garlic, celery, and beef. It is absolutely a delicious, delicious stew. I personally just really, really, really wanted something that was kind of reminiscent of my grandmother, and I wanted squash. So you can see in the background all of the squash that I had just kind of rough chopped in the rutabaga and everything for a dish that I'm going to prepare later. Here I'm just channeling some of my frustration issues into something more productive. And then I'm just going to dice up the garlic and put it with the onions. And you know, I do have a garlic press, but I remember using it, and then I remember the first time I tried to clean it. And by clean it, I mean leaving it in the dishwasher for like a month before realizing I actually had to clean it. And then I realized that I would just rather chop garlic by hand for the rest of my life. Chopping garlic is fun. Cleaning a garlic press sucks, unless you have a sous chef. Now we've just got some yellow potatoes. These are Yukon Gold potatoes. For this, you probably want to go with yellow potatoes or red potatoes. And it's because they will keep their shape better when cooking for a long period of time in something like a soup. I switched out the cutting board because I do not like cutting raw meat on the wood cutting board. No, beef is not a vegetable. Use the most inexpensive cut of beef that you can find. This is something that typically simmers for a very long time. You can use a cut that's probably not typically going to be very tender, but it will be tender here because of the cooking time. So again, we're just going to roughly cube this up. You can see I'm not using a whole lot of the beef, and that's because I'm not the biggest fan. So if you want to have like a really, really beefy stew, you can just add way more beef in there. Here I've got a 5-quart pan, and I put some butter down, and then I put some oil in there. And the oil and the butter, it just helps it so that the butter doesn't really burn. But I really like the flavor profile of butter, as do most people. So if you don't want to use the butter, you don't have to use the butter. You can see that I'm just throwing the beef in there, and then I'm going to season this. I'm going to season this very simply because I really want more of like the real pure flavors of the food to come through. So I'm just going with salt, pepper, and garlic powder. You can add other seasonings to this. If you wanted to, you could add thyme here. You could add rosemary here. You could add tarragon here. You could add sage here. Like any of those or a combination of any of those would be really, really good in this stew. Again, I just really kind of want to taste the purity of the food that I'm cooking. So I'm not really going with anything super heavy. If you're going to use fresh herbs, you probably want to do it like later on in the cooking process, but dried herbs, go ahead and add them all in here. I accidentally sort of boiled my beef. If that happens to you, like if you put it in and it's not browning, because what you want is the browning that you can see here at the bottom of the pan. Not burning, but browning, because that tastes really good. If it happens to you that you put it in and it just like has a whole bunch of liquid that comes out and is just boiling, a lot of times if you leave it for long enough, it will eventually brown. In my case, that wasn't working out, so all I do is drain out all of the liquid, and then I put the beef back in there, and then I brown it. In my case, that happened for 2 reasons. One was because my pan was not hot enough when I put my beef in, and 2 was because my beef was still ever so slightly frozen. In with the garlic and the onions, and we're just going to saute this until the onions are a little bit transparent. Those flavors come together. You will see that again, I season again, salt, pepper. Anytime that there is an opportunity to add more flavor into the dish, that is what you want to do. I do want to add a bit of an option here. So for someone who is vegan or a vegetarian, you can replace the butter that I added with your vegan butters. You can also replace the beef with what I think is really good is the Gardein beef tips. Those, they brown up really nicely, and you're really going to prepare them in the exact same way that you see me doing here. You're going to put in the Gardein beef tips, probably an entire bag is what you would want for this recipe. If you like shiitake mushrooms, you can add in some sliced up shiitake mushrooms, which will definitely add some extra flavor, and you can do that here whether you're vegan or whether you're not. Onions are getting a little bit of color on them. We're going to go in with all of the vegetables. They barely fit, but I'm not that worried about that because this will reduce a little bit as the cooking goes on. After all the vegetables are in, we're going to go in with 2 cans of beef consomme. They're 10.5 ounce cans. I was introduced to beef consomme by an ex-boyfriend. I guess even good things can come out of life's failures. Beef consomme has a richer flavor profile than just beef stock. If you want a stronger beefy flavor, you can add more beef consomme and less beef stock. Now I'm just adding in a 32 ounce container of beef stock. And that is beef stock, not bone broth. We aren't making diet soup. On that note, if you are vegan or vegetarian, there are a few things that I could recommend instead of the beef consomme or the beef broth. Edward & Sons not beef bouillon cubes. You just want to add a few of those in there. Or you can also go with Better Than Bouillon no beef base. Adding salt, pepper, and garlic powder once again. If you wanted to change the flavor profile a little bit, you could add in a can or 2 of crushed, diced, or stewed tomatoes. Just make sure that you add them in at this early stage. As a matter of fact, anytime you use canned tomatoes, add them in as early as possible so it cooks out the tin flavor. You can also just cut up some fresh cherry tomatoes and throw them in there. They have a wonderful, strong flavor. I'm just going to bring this up to a boil, and then I'm going to reduce the heat and put the lid on and allow it to simmer for probably about an hour. Come back and check, see if the vegetables are tender. Come back and check every 15 minutes or so, stirring it and stuff, just checking on it. But you really just want to cook it until the vegetables are tender, until the beef is tender. Here you can also see that I tasted this before putting the lid on. Again, really important that that broth tastes good, that the vegetables are cooking in. So I tasted it. It needed a little bit more salt. I added a little bit more salt. And a few hours later, it's done. Everything is nice and tender. The meat is nice and tender. The butternut squash is all but disappeared. Mostly it just kind of disintegrated into the soup, but that's okay because it added a great flavor to the broth. I'm so excited. You guys, this smells absolutely fantastic. Just amazing. It smells like my grandmother. It smells like fall. It smells like kitchen. It smells like family. Like I said, this is one of those things that to me is just like getting some kind of amazing warm hug. All right, let's do the taste test. Broth is amazing, absolutely rich, super flavorful. Beef is super, super tender. All the vegetables, they're nice and soft. The squash, I think, is just the star of this whole entire stew. And it was really interesting to me because you couldn't really tell, like, if you were going to get a piece of a rutabaga, a piece of the butternut squash, the buttercup squash, or the acorn squash. And that was kind of interesting because there's a little bit of a surprise as to what exactly you were putting in your mouth. But I think that the star of this soup actually ended up being the buttercup squash. It's absolutely delicious. I would highly recommend trying that squash if you've never had it before. I thought it was absolutely fabulous and will hands down be preparing it again. If you like your stew to have a thicker broth, more of like gravy consistency, you can create a slurry. So you want to mix some cornstarch with some water until it looks like about the consistency of skim milk, and mix it up really well so that there aren't any lumps in there. Again, keeping the heat on very, very low, and you just mix that in and it will thicken up in a few minutes. If you don't have cornstarch or you don't like cornstarch, you can use flour. Thanks. Bye.